Welcome everybody to the Discovery 2024 conference. This is our panel on AI. I'm the panel moderator, Lamont Black. I'm from DePaul University in Chicago. I'm also a fellow with the Filene Research Institute, leading the Credit Union of the Future. I'm joined by three esteemed panelists who will each introduce themselves. Let's start with George Chacon from Municipal Credit Union.
Thanks, Lamont. I'm George Chacon, Chief Strategy Officer at Municipal Credit Union in New York City. Really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great, thanks, George. And John Sahagian from BCU.
Yeah, hi everybody. Great to be here. John Sahagian. I'm the Chief Data Officer for BCU.
Great, thanks, John. And last but not least, Maya Mikhailov of Savvy AI.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maya. I'm CEO and co-founder of Savvy AI and former adjunct professor at NYU.
Excellent. All right, so what we're going to be doing during this session is giving you a sense of kind of what credit unions are doing in the AI space, but also some of the fintechs like Maya's company and how credit unions could be moving forward with this emerging technology of AI. And we're going to start with the big picture, just thinking about governance, leadership, how credit unions are trying to approach this in a way that makes sense for their members, how to manage the risks, but also lean into the opportunities. So we're going to start with John, because John's credit union, BCU, here in the Chicago area, has been doing quite a bit of work in this space. I've been supporting them, and one of those aspects is developing some AI principles for their credit union. And so we're going to share that on your screen. You'll be able to see what BCU has already put on paper. And John, if you could just get us started and tell us a little bit about BCU's journey around AI and how it brought you to these principles and how you're hoping to apply them at your credit union.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that, and this won't be different from all the other credit unions out there, but, when ChatGPT kind of first launched in early 23, everybody was scrambling a little bit to try and understand, well, what is this? It clearly has a lot of power to it. The barriers to use are really, really low. So of course we're a financial institution. Our next reaction is, oh my gosh, that's risk that we haven't understood and figured out and mitigated. So our first reaction was very much defense, but it wasn't very long before we started recognizing, well, hold on a second. If we're just completely on defense here, we're going to fall behind. This has a lot of power to it. We need to understand it. So we also have to have some offense going on here too. So in order to kind of make sure we are hitting on both offense and defense, we decided that we needed to start a committee. So we have an AI leadership committee that it reports back up to our technology committee on our board of directors. And it's made up of people across the organization, so people on the offensive side and on the business, but also leaders on the defensive side, like, security and legal. So we've got a good group of people. And one of the first things that we did was we put out a kind of a rudimentary acceptable use standard and a kind of a disclosure form. So we asked people to say, okay, you can use these different tools that are kind of starting to come out, but here are the do's and the don'ts. Here are some of the things you really have to look out for. So that was our kind of out of the gate. The committee then basically said, okay, we need to have a kind of a statement for the organization that says, all right, these tools are coming. We're still trying to understand the risks and the applications and such, but we need to make sure that we set some principles out of the gate to tie back to, first of all, to acknowledge what's going on, but to then tie that back to, oh, hold on a second, there's risks and there's responsibilities associated with this. So let's make sure that our shared values as an organization are reflected in how we're using AI. But then let's also make sure that everybody is aware of the risks, but also, and this is the final, but I think really important point, was to say, you are still responsible, right? Whoever is using these are tools for you to do stuff, but you are still doing stuff. So that personal responsibility was another piece we were trying to accomplish here.
Awesome. Let me just read through these 7 principles that BCU has laid out. So I love that number 1 is member first, very credit union focused. But then they've got augment our people, accountability, data privacy, security and governance, explainable and transparency, accurate and reliable, and then lastly, fairness and bias detection. So I think this is a great example, and I appreciate John and BCU being willing to share these with the audience of how are credit unions trying to form some guardrails around this, but also I love that that first one's really answering the why, not just viewing this as risk and protection, but really why are you even entering into AI? Do you want to add anything on the why for BCU, John?
And I think that, we share this with, other credit unions. We're not for profits. We're cooperatives, and we exist to create value for our members. So, as we get wrapped up in some of these new cool technologies, we just wanted to make sure that first and foremost, we're always asking the question, it's like, okay, this may be really cool. This may have some great efficiency associated with it, but let's make sure that we're never losing sight of the reason why we do anything is to create value for our members. I mean, there are some things that could pop up here that could be, and I think this is where you get into some of the fairness and bias detection. We want to make sure that we are never doing any harm to our members or to the value we create for our members, and that's always first and foremost.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, John. All right, so we're going to move on, and I'd like to turn it to George. So George, you are the Chief Strategy Officer at Municipal Credit Union in New York, and you and I were talking at one of the recent Filene events. So Municipal is a sponsor of the Center at Filene, the Credit Union of the Future, and you've been giving a lot of thought to this. This is part of your job responsibility at Municipal. And I know you've also hired an AI engineer. So you're thinking about this from like a leadership perspective. How do you start to incorporate this into your organization? Why don't you tell our folks a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Lamont. I think we tossed around the question of where AI should live within the organization for a while. And where we landed was that it would live in strategy with myself, Chief Strategy Officer. And there are a couple of, things that we think we can accomplish by doing that. First is, I would own the vision and strategy for AI at MCU, but it also involves developing a roadmap for, what we see use cases in the next 1 to 3 years. More importantly, assembling a diverse team that can see that roadmap through, and also bringing outside expertise to augment some of the internal expertise we already have. And so I think at the center of the organization with strategy for us, it's a good place to have it, working alongside all the business units. And, the way we are envisioning AI living at MCU is as an accelerant, as an enabler of strategy, which is, like John said, centered around the member.
And I love that it's not just viewed as a technology. It's not just something you're kind of like buying and, deploying out of your IT department. It's really thinking about this organizationally, thinking about more forward looking. All right, Maya. So you have a background in AI. I think you should tell folks a little bit about that, what you were doing even before you moved into this new role with the new company. But, you're someone who's helping lead the kind of conversation from a technical perspective, helping credit unions become more aware of what they can do with this, but also how they can move forward with it so it doesn't feel so overwhelming, so they don't feel like they have to figure it out on their own.
Sure. I've been building with AI and machine learning tools since 2014, which is really 147 years at the rate that AI is changing in AI terms today. And in my last role, I was at Synchrony Financial, and I built and led a new AI division there. And we were purpose-driven to bring practical AI solutions to the bank to build out these tools for their credit and banking systems. But I just wanted to touch on, I loved what the previous two speakers had said. John, I love that you referred to AI as a tool, because I think more people have to think about it as a toolkit. It's exactly what it is. It's a toolkit to solve problems, just like Microsoft Office is a toolkit to get your work done during the day. And I think as we start looking at how AI can solve credit union problems, if we keep reminding ourselves that this is a tool to help folks succeed both inside the credit union and to help members achieve their goals, it's important to keep grounded in that. What we're seeing is, to build off of what George said, that AI is an accelerant of strategy. That was a great way of putting it. That what it's really doing in the last decade, we've been told data is the new oil. We have to collect all this data. Data is super important to making better decisions. And in the last decade, credit unions have been collecting data to help their members succeed. But now, what can they do to help make better decisions with that data? And that's where AI and machine learning come into play. It's actually a very practical tool to operationalize that data to help credit unions make better decisions on, achieving their goals, whether it's growing deposits, helping loans, helping make better loans, or helping identify which loans are about to go delinquent so they can work with their customers to achieve their goals as well. That's where I see the power of AI playing right now. It's in these very practical, actionable use cases on the data sets that credit unions already have, but really accelerating that data and helping them make those better decisions.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you brought that experience into this new role, Maya, because I think that will really help credit unions think about what they can do with this, with the data that they have. Because one of the things I've tried to tell credit unions, you are data companies.
Yes.
You're not in the manufacturing business. It's all zeros and ones. You're just moving numbers around different accounts. And so if you can figure out how to analyze that data more effectively, then you can really maximize the value back for the member. All right, let's conclude this first part around governance, leadership, with just a kind of an open discussion about risks, ethics, because I know this is a big topic with AI. A lot of people are rightfully scared about where this might be headed, and as regulated institutions, you want to make sure that you're managing those risks effectively. Those could be, data privacy and security risks. It could be ethical issues around bias as it relates to lending or other types of decisioning. How should credit unions be approaching this so that they don't get stuck with that point, but they are effectively putting in some guardrails to manage risks and ethics?
It's important to kind of set a baseline understanding across the organization of what AI is, how it's going to function in the organization, and continue on the path with those diverse perspectives that I mentioned before. One of the things that early on we saw was we kept having to re-explain to different people what we were doing on some small use cases we were embarking on. It's because we didn't bring everybody along. I think when you kind of level set with everyone in the organization on kind of how we think about AI and how we plan to use it, what it is, and then continue on with that diverse group, you'll always get the perspectives you need to be able to set the guardrails you need to not get yourself in trouble. And so that's how we're thinking about it. Again, we're early on in our path to AI, but that's how we're approaching it. Just make sure you have the right people in the room to bring those perspectives to you.
Yes, and I love that concept of bringing people along on the journey, making sure you're having those conversations. A lot of credit unions, I think they're talking about it with the leadership team, but they're not talking about it with staff or broadly across the organization. So people are probably wondering, well, I don't know, how does the leadership team even feel about AI? And so making it inclusive, really getting that bottom-up approach. John, what were you going to add?
It's interesting because I was going to say, kind of the same thing that George was talking about, but I would also add that, I could see credit unions or businesses in general getting a little bit stuck, because when you start thinking about some of the risks associated with different applications of AI or different types of AI altogether, and it can get really overwhelming when you start thinking about all the risks and all the controls you need to put in place, and it could prevent you from taking the first step. So I think it's really important as you're talking throughout your organizations to make sure that you're educating on the fact that, hey, look, there's a lot of different flavors of AI that we're talking about here, and there's a lot of different flavors of use cases, and they all have different risks associated with them. So if we work to, kind of crawl, walk, run, let's start with some relatively low risk, easier ways so that we can get started. And then we can incrementally, as we discover new ways that we want to leverage these technologies, we can step back and say, okay, well, what do we have to do to expand our risk prevention, our policies and standards, et cetera. But I fear about this with BCU too. That it's like if we overwhelm ourselves with thinking we have to protect against the biggest, baddest, deepest, use case and technology that we can dream up, we're never going to get off Go, right? So start with something simple, low risk, and build from there.
Awesome. All right, so that kind of gives us the big picture. Hopefully, for those of you watching, that's helpful to kind of frame your conversations, think about the role of the board, role of a leadership team, an AI committee, strategy. How do you start to organize around this? But I know a lot of credit unions are trying to figure out, okay, even if we have some of these policies and principles in place, how do we move forward with experimentation? What are some of those first steps if we want to crawl, walk, and run? So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about kind of two broad categories of AI. And these are terms that I think people are familiar with, but it might be helpful to distinguish them a little bit. So, if you've heard of machine learning, that's going to be one of the categories. And the second one is generative AI. And one way generative also uses machine learning. So this is not a hard and fast rule. But if you think of machine learning as more traditional analytics that is predictive, so, algorithms used for lending or other types of solutions, but in a way that is continuing to learn and evolve and improve. So that's like machine learning applications of AI. And then generative AI is going to be all of the stuff that we've talked about around ChatGPT, large language models, and how you can do textual analysis, prompts, and queries, and so on. So we're going to talk about these two separately. And I would suggest for any credit union exploring AI to think of these as two broad categories and how you might want to approach each of them distinctly. And I'm going to start with Maya on the machine learning, because Savvy AI is a company that helps credit unions use and apply machine learning models on different aspects of their data for different business applications. So Maya, if you could just give us your take on what is machine learning and why is this important for credit unions as a tool?
Absolutely. Machine learning, simply put, is powerful math on top of data. It's actually been around for quite a long time. It's the reason Netflix works. It's the reason Amazon knows what product to suggest for you. Those are all background use cases of machine learning, finding patterns in data, and then executing against those patterns, either to make a prediction, a recommendation, a classification, or decision. What we're seeing in credit unions right now is, as I mentioned before, they're sitting on a wealth of data. And much of that data is locked up in spreadsheets right now. It's tabular data, it's thousands and thousands of columns, tens of thousands of rows of data, and data analysts on teams going a little bit cross-eyed, trying to find that needle in a haystack of insight that leads them to say, oh gosh, this depositor might churn soon. Or, oh, wow, this loan is at risk. We need to help get in front of that and help this member succeed. And what we're finding is that what machine learning is really good at is helping crunch through that data and find those patterns of success so that credit unions can better serve their membership, so that they don't have to spend all of this time just looking at their data. They can start now taking actions and designing strategies around that data.
Let me just go ahead and jump to the next category of generative AI and ask George and John, just as you think about these tools. So I sometimes think about like vertical deep dive use cases of AI, but then these more horizontal. So kind of the general tool that can be applied across the employee base, whether that's a ChatGPT or Copilot or something else. How do you think about those at your credit unions? I know a lot of credit unions have put in policies, and John already mentioned one of those. Do you see this as a productivity tool? How do you think your people are perceiving these tools? John, you and I have done a lot of listening sessions with the BCU staff. I think this would be a good place to talk about those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's it's interesting with generative AI. It's really a new way of thinking for a lot of people, and a new tool, Maya, to for people to take into and address their own problems and their own challenges and aspirations that they have in their business. So we have been having a lot of conversations across the organization for the sole purpose of getting the dialogue going, to help people understand what does this mean exactly, and why is this such a wonderful opportunity. So, I think just getting that conversation going is really important because I think a lot of people that we've talked to, really smart people, they don't totally get what this is or why they should be really excited about it. But they are quick to be worried about why they should be worried about this particular tool. So that's one thing about generative AI. I think that's really important at each of our businesses is to make sure that people know that this isn't something that they have to necessarily be scared of. And in fact, it's something, if they embrace it, could help them be more successful in what they do. Whether it's an individual role or a business function or whatever.
Yeah, and part of those listening sessions was hearing all the stories about how people are already using this,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
I think some leaders might be surprised how much it's already happening within their own organization.
For sure.
George, what are your thoughts on generative
Yeah,
AI?
I think for us, it's been around at this point around a lot of like efficiencies for our employees. How can we show them that this technology can help them get access to information more quickly so that they can spend quality time serving our members? Um, and so that's kind of where we are today. But we are seeing some signals, like you said, Lamont, of the fact that our employees personally are already using a lot of this technology, and I think they would adopt it much quicker than I think we assumed they would when we make it available to them on a broad basis. And so it's an efficiency play right now, but there's so much more that we can do outside of kind of those horizontal broad efficiency use cases, and we're excited to eventually start exploring those.
All right, let's jump into use cases because I want to make sure we keep moving along here. So, keeping with this categorization, machine learning and generative AI, let's come back to machine learning. Think about the data and how to build these really smart math tools on top of the data, as Maya was describing. I know a lot of credit unions have worked with vendors who do like automated loan underwriting or decisioning. That's an area that I think has been uh, rolled out within the credit union industry for several years now, way prior to ChatGPT. So let's just talk about kind of machine learning and use cases at credit unions, whether that's loan decisioning or growing deposits. Maya, why don't we start back with you? I know you and I had talked about deposit growth as being a major concern or a focus for many credit union leaders right now. And that could be like, well, we need more marketing campaigns or something like that. But there's a lot of analytics they could do to improve deposits as well.
It's amazing when we start talking to folks at credit unions about deposits. I said, you already have the data you need in your member transaction history. You're already looking at this wealth of information that's being funneled at you every single day about what your members are doing. And now you can start finding signals in that noise. What are the signs that a member may churn? And how can you get folks ahead of it? Not just churn next month, churn 6 months from now. How can you find those members that are most likely at risk and start building back that relationship with them or finding out why they're at risk? How can you find patterns in your membership of folks whose deposit is going right back out the door for maybe a wealth management tool like Robinhood? Maybe that's a tool that you have already offered within your credit union, and you can preserve that deposit if only that those people knew that you had competitive tools already available to them. So a lot of it is just, again, activating the data you already have. You don't need new data. You're already seeing all of the actionable data through that deposit, through those transactions. Now start unlocking some insights there and putting it to action. But as you pointed out, Lamont, accurately, decision around lending has been a very common use case for machine learning for a while, because I think that's where teams felt really comfortable. Hey, we already have decision rules. This is just kind of putting those rules into action and automating it. But there's so much more that you can do outside of lending, even figuring out which loans are at risk or which accounts are at risk for overdraft. Again, these are all patterns that can be found within the data that you have. The question is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I talk to folks at credit unions about this all the time. Start with the problem. Don't start with the technology. I don't care if it's machine learning. I don't care if it's generative. Is there really a problem to be solved here? And then is there another technique that's probably easier to solve it? If not, then start thinking about, okay, how are we going to solve it, and how are we going to design a system to solve it?
Yeah, great. John, if I could turn to you. So, if you could remind folks of your title, your role as it relates to data at BCU, and, you've got folks that report up to you in this area who are working on these models and, building some of them internally. And I know you and I had a conversation with your lending department recently about how this could potentially be applied in the area of lending, even beyond some of the existing things you're already doing. When you think about predictive analytics and the data foundation that BCU has already laid, like with your data warehouse, where would you like to take this as you go further with machine learning?
Well, I think a couple of things come to mind, especially, hearing some of Maya's comments, and I couldn't agree with her more. One of the things when we talk about machine learning, because, we could come up with all kinds of crazy ideas for let's build a model for this or let's build a model for that. It's got to start with, what's the question that if we could answer this question, it could generate an incredible amount of value because we could do something with it, right? So really the best analytics don't start with the best analysts. It starts with the best questions, right? So find the right question to answer and then start to utilize that wealth of data that you have and the skill sets and partners that you have to go and answer that question predictively. So as chief data officer, one of the things that I do have to, and I don't mean to be the party pooper here, but the important thing here is, Maya's right. We have a ton of data. We have a ton of valuable data at our fingertips, but we have to make sure that we trust and understand, and we can get access to that data. So I really would encourage anybody that doesn't have it already in place to start looking at, getting their arms around their data management. What's the quality of our data? What does our data mean? Where is it? Which data within my data sets can I trust? Having that in place is really, really important. A lot of people just generally will refer to this as data governance, and that's a big part of it. But putting data governance in place will make the ability to leverage it for all of those, really answering those really cool questions with machine learning is really, really important.
Great. Yeah, I think, your role at BCU, you really can speak to that issue of data quality, and that really is the foundation for all these analytical tools to make sure, you got to have quality coming in to get quality coming out. So let's move on to the second category. We've talked about a few use cases for machine learning, now a few use cases for generative AI. And George, I know you've started to do some of this experimentation at Municipal, thinking about not just how do we use these kind of generative tools on the internet, which is what most people think of when they think of ChatGPT, but for some internal information or a knowledge base or some piece of a knowledge base. And I think you've got an interesting use case you've been working with, so maybe you could tell folks about that.
Yeah, so remember I talked a little bit about low fidelity, safe use cases. Just to be able to experience the technology, we leveraged our employee handbook and connected it to ChatGPT for our employees to, if they have questions about benefits, rules and regulations, policies, so on and so forth, they can leverage this tool. And a few things that we've learned. One is that it's better than rifling through 96 pages of an employee handbook. Um,
Or scrolling through a PDF.
right, scrolling through a PDF. So it's helpful in that way. But I think we've seen some other signals of our employees asking the tool to help them rewrite an email that's unrelated to the handbook. So it's just a signal of like, folks are eager to use some of these tools, or at least interested in using some of these tools. Um, and so we're looking at now, all right, how do we take this beyond the handbook and maybe start to put some procedures into the tool so that our front lines can, again, spend more time servicing our members and not rifling through or scrolling through PDFs of procedures. So that was our first use case. We thought it was very safe. We spun it up pretty quickly. And if it wouldn't have worked, we could have kind of killed it quickly without feeling guilty. And so that helped us gain an understanding. And I think we're going to use those learnings onto the next use case.
Yeah, that's great. And I know a lot of credit unions that are exploring in this space, also looking at the knowledge base, maybe employee handbook, also any, even products and services. So for a contact center, for someone working at the contact center to be able to answer a question more quickly, more effectively, that serves the member better. It also makes the contact center job less stressful. So you don't have someone just waiting or yelling. And so those are, but it's all still internal facing. So you don't have the super high risk of something that's member facing. Once you get comfortable with it, once you know it's working, then you can start opening that up to the member for self-servicing and other things. So again, part of that journey. And I think you've got a great example of how to get started with that.
Hey, Lamont, on that point, just to come back to it, your knowledge base or your handbook or whatever, that's data. That's data that you're going to be using to train these models. So there have been people that, I've talked to other credit unions, and they say, yeah, we turned it on, it was awful. But the reason it was awful is because our handbook hadn't been updated in 3 years, and there was stuff in there we didn't even remember. So curating the things you're going to train these bots on is super, super important. I remember at one point we had 3 different independent knowledge bases, and none of them were being actively managed. So it was pretty much garbage, right? So at a certain point, we went through the effort of saying that knowledge base, we're going to consolidate it into one knowledge base, and there are going to be responsibilities of people to keep all those articles up to date. And because we do that, now that generative AI tool becomes hugely important because we can train it on that curated data set. So just a point to there, if you want to get your credit union ready for success with generative AI, one of the greatest things you could do is to look at all the documentation of your business and clean it up.
John, I completely agree. Generative isn't going to solve certain process problems if the problem is that your data, your procedures and process are simply out of date. It's not going to magically intuit what your newest policies and procedures are. But I just wanted to go back to, Lamont, something you touched on with George's use case, which is that human beings are still in the loop of his use case. And I think that is really critically important with either machine learning or with generative AI, that these are tools where we're still keeping frontline people, frontline team members involved to oversee how these tools are being used. We're not just hitting a button and letting it go off and make decisions, make recommendations, et cetera, without a knowledgeable worker or a subject matter expert looking over the results saying, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, here's what we have to tweak, here's what we have to refine. So I think to level set expectations for credit unions looking to execute with machine learning or generative AI tools, you still want and need your folks in there, looking at the results of these tools and making sure the results are up to snuff, meet expectations, or they might have to go down to data discovery, exactly what John said. Why is this giving us such bad results? Why is this so wrong in its answers about our policies? Well, gosh, the information we're feeding it is really out of date. So it can uncover these problems that you already have as well.
Yeah, that's great. So that's given all our viewers a taste of some of the use cases that are out there. There's a lot of other credit unions exploring more use cases. You can take all your transcripts from your contact center, feed those into a large language model to understand, why are your people calling? What are their needs? Are those needs being met? So there's a lot of, I think, fascinating things that can be done here. All right, so let's hear your concluding thoughts. Anybody want to start? Should we start with George? George, what would you like to share with our audience as we wrap up this panel on AI?
I think, we're on the cusp of disruption. And I just want to implore, encourage credit unions across the country to do something. I think taking no action is not an option given how fast this technology is moving. So I just encourage folks to do something and get on the path to seeing how they can use these tools to keep them competitive and serve their members better in the future.
Excellent, thank you. John?
Sure, that's well said. This is going to be an iterative process, so make sure that if you do nothing else, start with step number one, right? It's going to be a long journey, but it's going to start with a single step. Start taking those steps. I would encourage people to really work hard to try and generate those conversations at your organizations. Because, we may be throwing out a few use cases now. They're the same, initial use cases that most people are talking about. There are hundreds of use cases that we're going to start to think of as we start to factor this into how we approach problems and how we approach, strategies at our organizations. So the sooner people start using this as part of their conversation and part of how they approach, problems, then I think that we're really going to be surprised with how many different ways that we come up with of how to apply this technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's open. That's what's so great about this, is like, if you can dream it, you can start to try and build it. Maya.
I just go back to think about the problems you're trying to solve. This isn't a technology looking for a problem to solve. There are actual problems that you have that you're facing every single day, some of which might be great candidates for machine learning or generative AI. Start with those. Don't try to reimagine a new problem to solve just because you fell in love with using a technology a couple of times. And then secondly, what John said, think about the data that you have. Think about how you can access that data. And honestly, it doesn't have to be that difficult. Sometimes it's in a CSV or Excel spreadsheet. You can start from there. But to John's point, you have to start somewhere. And lastly, the last point I want to make is that AI is a technology, but the technology is getting easier and easier. The change management that George and John have alluded to during this conversation is a big part of this journey. Making sure that your folks internally are brought along this journey and that it's not something that's being applied to them. It's something that they're excited about. It's something that they see how it benefits them in their day-to-day jobs. It's something that they see as bringing value, because you're not going to solve this problem with just a technology being applied to it. Make sure teams are educated and you think about the change management steps.
Yeah, that's great, Maya. And credit unions really are all about people, not just the members, but also the employees. And so if we're going to do AI in the credit union industry, how do we make sure that it's people-centric AI, so that it's empowering people, people are getting excited. And I'm a big believer, I think employee satisfaction is going to go up across credit unions that start to use these tools, because if it can help them with the grind and the grunt work, and then they're like, oh, I can think about like other things and like solve higher level problems, then I think we're really going to be on to something. All right. Well, I think that's it for our AI panel in the Discovery 2024 conference. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lamont Black. We've got George Chacon, John Sahagian, and Maya Mikhailov. And we appreciate you being part of this, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.